As we know that you love to know information about us, we will tell you some curiosities. Many of you already know that we live in Galicia, an autonomous community in the north of Spain. Our region is known for being Terra de Meigas, that is, land of witches. Our community is full of traditions, stories, and legends in which magic and horror stories are very present. That's why we love this genre. There is a saying that goes, I don't believe in witches, but habelas haylas, which means we don't believe in witches, but they are out there. In a small town in Mexico lived a beautiful young woman who, since she was little, had been dreaming about having a wonderful wedding. Even before meeting her significant other, she already knew what she wanted that special day to be like. She even loved playing pretend about her perfect wedding. Her dress would be simple, but with a big tail, and she wanted to wear flowers on her head, adorning her marvelous bride. The banquet would be in her house backyard, and dozens of fruit trees would be there. As she grew up, she gradually got more and more obsessed about meeting he who would be her husband. And so, for her, every failure in love felt like a blow with a mallet. Until she eventually met the one, and from the first day, she knew. She fell in love, and just 6 months later, they already had a solid relationship. He was very liked in the town, and he came from a wealthy but very hardworking and respected family. They lived a long and happy relationship together, until finally the dreams of this young woman would finally become a reality. One summer afternoon, her boyfriend proposed to her. The next months were filled with preparations. She took out all the notebooks she had been writing on throughout the years with thousands of ideas for her wedding. With care and dedication, she prepared every detail of that long-awaited day. The food, the guests, the decorations, everything was prepared and measured to the tiniest detail. And that includes her dress, of course, which the town's tailor would be making. Everything was going according to plan, and she was feeling like the happiest person in that humble town. However, just when the great ceremony was just a few hours away, a neighbor went to see the young woman to tell her that her boyfriend was cheating on her with her best friend. At that moment, she was trying on her wedding dress for the last time and became mad with jealousy. She went out of her house without taking off her dress and headed directly to where her future husband was supposedly cheating on her. And with her own eyes, she saw it was all true. The love of her life was kissing with her best friend, the very same friend who had helped her prepare the wedding. Filled with rage, she grabbed a stick she found in the lounge and started beating up both of them. It's like she was possessed by a demon and all she wanted was revenge. Bloody and ashamed, her two victims could barely defend themselves, especially when she grabbed a knife and started stabbing them both. First her best friend and then her former fiancé. Her wedding dress was now completely soaked in blood, the very one she had designed with so much care. She believed her life had no value anymore and all she wanted was to cry. Then the townsfolk treated her like a pariah. They would constantly berate her and everyone ostracized her. She knew she would be jailed sooner or later, and that's the last thing she wanted, so she decided to take her own life instead. And her neighbors, far from feeling pity for her, organized a huge party to celebrate the occasion. They really hated her. And for that reason, she could never rest in peace. Her resentment and her thirst for revenge were still present in her soul, and that prevented her from crossing to the afterlife. Or at least that's what the townsfolk believed. After her death, every time a young man and woman became a couple in the town, strange things would happen. The woman would frequently feel that she was being touched or would hear voices, always from a woman saying that she cannot trust her boyfriend. And in most cases, the woman would end up becoming completely crazy and committing horrible acts. The townsfolk believe that this woman cast a lot of curse in the town. Since she discovered her boyfriend's betrayal, she doesn't let anybody else be happy, resulting in the town being plunged in absolute sadness. Every night, you can hear her ghost moving chairs and sewing fabric remnants as if she was still preparing her wedding. The very same wedding that led to her hating love with all her might. So be careful if you fall in love, TikTokers, since she can always appear to traumatize your significant other. And if she is successful, you will be done for. Today, we'll be traveling to Latin America to talk about one of the most horrible events that has ever taken place there in the last 10 years. That day, Mel was running late for work. It was the 4th time she had overslept, and the previous day she had been warned that she would be fired if this happened again. Thus, she was driving to work so fast she couldn't evade a truck going towards her. She woke up in the hospital 2 hours later, with her arm in a plaster and her head and thorax bandaged. And just when she was starting to realize where she was, a nurse went into the room, where 5 more hospitalized patients were resting. The nurse was bringing everyone their lunch, but when she gave Mel hers, their gazes clashed for a couple of seconds, enough for Mel to feel shivers go down her entire body. Then the young nurse ordered Mel to give her her phone, arguing that it was forbidden to have it there for security reasons. Mel wasn't completely convinced, but ended up doing what the nurse demanded. Time passed by and the visiting hours were finally on. However, Mel found it strange that all the patients were receiving visits from their loved ones, except her. And so Mel asked for permission to call her family and check if anything had happened to them, but the nurse denied her request. Nighttime came, and due to how worried she was, Mel couldn't sleep. It was 3 a.m. when suddenly, from the darkness, she saw someone enter the room and stand right before one of the beds. "Where are you taking me?" The response was, "We are going for a little ride." She instantly recognized the voice of that nurse who had scared her so much, and saw how that figure took the patient out of the room. The next day, one of the beds in the room was still missing. Mel didn't dare to ask about it, but she knew that what she saw the previous night was not normal. That day, nobody came to visit her either, and the staff then gave her the news that she would have to spend at least 48 extra hours hospitalized in there. She started to have a really bad feeling about the whole thing. But despite how worried Mel was, the next night she finally fell asleep due to lack of sleep. However, when she woke up, yet another one of the beds went missing, and she knew that that patient had not been released yet. Mel then decided to ask the nurse, since she was starting to get suspicious about that hospital and thought that maybe she was going crazy. He passed away last night because of a heart attack." Mel didn't believe her, and so she devised a plan. Mel waited until lunchtime, waiting for the staff to be at the cafeteria. She then made sure nobody was around, went to the storage unit of that floor, and got her phone back. Mel then called her mother to tell her about what happened, and she told Mel that the staff at the hospital were not allowing her to see Mel. And so Mel prepared herself. She would break out of the hospital that very night, but not before finding out what was really going on. She waited for the nurse to come back to take away another patient, and she carefully followed them. She then saw how the nurse sedated the patient before bringing him into an operating room. There was a surgeon waiting inside, and then both the surgeon and the nurse grabbed 2 enormous saws to dismember that man. They then extracted his heart, liver, and kidneys and placed them in a box. That's when the nurse turned around and saw horrified Mel looking behind the glass. The nurse simply smiled at Mel while covered in blood. "You are next." Mel rushed out of the hospital and called the police once she considered she was safe. This fateful event resulted in a huge public scandal, and both the nurse and the surgeon were arrested. The two declared that they weren't the only ones dedicated to such monstrous activities, that a huge organ trafficking network existed and that it could never be stopped. Hello, my name is John. Today I need to vent and tell my story. Years ago, I met Anna. We were two young people who seemed destined to be together. We spent hours talking about our dreams, sharing laughter, and exploring a world full of possibilities. The spark between us was undeniable, and the attraction and passion grew more every day. We ended up together and got married. The wedding was an unforgettable day for both of us. I can't describe what I felt when I realized that we would be together forever. I would be her partner and she would be mine until the end of our days. However, as it happens in many relationships, over time, cracks began to appear. At first, these were small discrepancies in our opinions and tastes. But soon I noticed that Anna was beginning to distance herself. Deep, passionate conversations became rarer, replaced by awkward silences and monosyllabic responses. She seemed lost in thought, and although my intuition told me something was wrong, I held on to the belief that our relationship could overcome any obstacle. One of the first warning signs was his sudden interest in spending more time away from home. Her work meetings became more and more frequent, and the hours she spent away extended into the night. And no, don't call me sexist or old or tell me that I didn't trust my wife, because I know you're thinking that. I tried to stay calm, trusting that she had reasons for being gone for so long. But the shadow of doubt was already hanging over our relationship. One night, when Anna returned home after one of her supposed meetings, I noticed her averted gaze and trembling hands. I asked her about her day, and she was evasive. My suspicions grew, but I didn't want to think about the possibility that she was being unfaithful to me. The evidence of her deception slowly began to accumulate. I discovered a perfume on her clothes that I didn't recognize, and on one occasion, I found a small hoop earring in the back seat of her car. I knew it wasn't hers. I'm very observant, and she always wore big, colorful earrings. When I presented this evidence to her, Anna always had an excuse ready. The perfume was a gift from a friend, and the earring must have fallen from a coworker. Despite these signs, my love for my wife was so deep that I refused to accept the reality before my eyes. I believed in the sincerity of her words, but I didn't ignore the mysterious calls she received late at night. That her phone was always on silent, or that when she had it in her hands, she would walk away from me as if she were hiding something. Every message or call increased my worry. Confirmation of her infidelity came when one day, while she was showering, I went to her laptop to look for a bill that had arrived in her email. Searching for the document I needed, I found a message that took my breath away. It was a compromising email from an unnamed sender. The content detailed secret encounters and passionate adventures. My hands shook as I read each word, and the pain I felt was unbearable. I felt guilty for invading her privacy, but my need for answers was overwhelming. I couldn't resist the temptation and sent a message, pretending to be her. What I received in return was a curt response. I got the impression that that person knew Anna very well. I knew it wasn't her, perhaps because of my way of writing. I couldn't contain myself, and I told my wife. And once again, Anna managed to convince me that it was spam or some kind of bad joke. She assured me that she didn't know who had written that to her, and indeed, she hadn't answered it. I desperately wanted to believe her. Although the evidence of her infidelity was evident, my love for Anna was a chain that kept me trapped in a relationship that was slowly falling apart. The struggle between what I knew and what I wanted created a constant tension within me, and reality mixed with denial in a whirlpool that seemed to have no end. My mornings and breakfast alone began with the same question in mind. Where had Anna been last night? Her response when I got it was usually vague and evasive. She said she had work meetings or impromptu dinners with friends who needed her support. But the lack of details and her nervous demeanor were telling. So like a detective, I've begun my search for answers. The first step was to find out what she was hiding on her phone. It wasn't easy, as she almost never left it unattended, and on the few opportunities I had, I scanned it for suspicious messages or calls. But she was clever, erasing any compromising traces and keeping her main apps locked with a password. So I started following their social media closely. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. No platform was safe from my scrutiny. Anna used to be very active, sharing photos, stories, and details of her life. However, I noticed that she had started to be more cautious. Her photos were more ambiguous, and her interactions had become more private. Mysterious comments or likes began to appear on her posts, which increased my suspicions. My heart was pounding, but I knew I needed more than a like on a photo to confront an argument like that with my wife. One afternoon, after another day full of doubts and suspicions, I decided to seek support from someone I could trust. My sister-in-law, Marta, my brother's wife. I had always had a close relationship with her, and I knew I could count on her advice if difficult times. So after taking a deep breath, I decided to call her and ask her to meet me. We met in a cozy little cafe that we used to go to on occasions. Marta immediately noticed the concern on my face and asked me what was happening. I was hesitant at first, but finally decided to open up and tell her everything. "Marta, I need to talk to you about something that is destroying me inside," I said with a broken voice. She looked at me worriedly and shakily and encouraged me to continue. I explained in detail everything that was happening in my marriage to Anna, from the signs of her infidelity to my failed attempts to get answers. Marta listened attentively, nodding silently as she spoke. When I finished telling my story, she took my hand understandingly. "John, I'm so sorry you're going through this. It must be incredibly difficult," she said empathetically. I nodded sadly. "It is, Marta. I'm caught between what I know and what I want to believe. I don't want to lose Anna, but I also can't ignore all the evidence I find every day." Marta sighed and looked deeply into my eyes. She told me that trust was essential in a marriage. But what could I do? Rather, what should I do? I grabbed a tissue to wipe away all the tears that were on my face. My sister-in-law pondered for a moment and then spoke calmly. She told me that communication was key in any relationship. She encouraged me to tell her how I felt and to listen to her response. Because sometimes things weren't what they seemed. I looked at her, grateful for her advice. "You're right, communication is key. But what do I do if she keeps denying everything?" Marta smiled at me and assured me that everything would be fine. She was sure that my wife would not be unfaithful to me. The truth is that her words calmed me a lot, because in addition to having a very good relationship with me, she also knew Anna well. Although it had been several months since the four of us had been together with my brother, she could give me advice and better understand what was going on in my wife's head, after all. She was also a woman, and there was a special connection between them, which was sometimes incomprehensible among men. I appreciated the support and trust that Marta gave me. I felt a little relief, thinking that maybe my paranoia was exaggerating things. I decided to follow her advice and try to talk openly and honestly with my wife. After a conversation, I felt stronger and determined to deal with the situation in an adult way. The next few days were difficult as I waited for an opportunity to have that crucial conversation with her. Suspicions were still running through my head, but I tried to stay calm and not jump to conclusions. My goal was to solve our problems, not accuse without solid evidence. Finally, one afternoon, while Anna and I were sharing dinner at home, I found the right moment to broach the topic. I took a deep breath and told her that we had to talk, that I had noticed that things were a little complicated lately, and I couldn't continue with so many doubts. She looked at me with surprise, as if she wasn't expecting that conversation. I explained to her how distant I had felt from her in recent months, and how suspicions of infidelity had begun to affect our relationship. I asked her to be honest with me and share her feelings. She seemed uncomfortable, but finally started talking and assured me that there was no extramarital affair. I decided to trust her sincerity. I accepted that, as Marta had suggested, perhaps things weren't what they seemed. Over the next few weeks, Anna and I worked on rebuilding our relationship. We openly communicated our needs and concerns and began spending more time together. It seemed that things were gradually improving, and my hope that we could overcome this crisis grew day by day. However, one night, as I was leaving the house in search of some fresh air to clean my head, something happened that changed everything again. While walking through a vacant lot near our neighborhood, I saw a car parked in a secluded corner. As I approached it, I recognized Marta's car, my sister-in-law. Intrigued, I slowly approached the vehicle, thinking there might have been some problem. It was a strange place and time to be there, so I didn't hesitate to check out how she was. But what I saw through the car window left me completely stunned and frozen to the spot. Inside the car, I saw Anna and Marta both naked. They were in an intimate and compromising situation that I could not believe. My heart sunk and a wave of emotions washed over me. I was paralyzed, unable to process what I was seeing. Those furtive glances, that intensity with which they touched each other, their bodies, naked and intertwined inside the car, gave off a burning desire that was palpable even from outside. They embraced each other with unbridled passion, their hands eagerly covering every inch of the other's skin. Sighs escaped their lips as they gave themselves over completely to the lust of the moment. Tears filled my eyes as I watched the scene, feeling doubly betrayed and hurt. First for my wife, but also for my sister-in-law, who had deceived me in that hypocritical way with that advice, trying to guide my attention elsewhere. After all, on that afternoon of confessions in the cafe, I had been telling her my worries and looking into the eyes of my wife's lover. She had laughed in my face. I couldn't understand how they could have come to this. My mind was blank and I didn't know what to do. My hands shook as I watched the betrayal unfold before my eyes. My mind was filled with the whirlwind of emotions. Anger, sadness, confusion. I didn't know how to react, but fury began to grow inside me like a ravenous flame. I walked away from the car in a state of shock, trying to process what I had just witnessed. The images of Anna and Marta remained etched in my mind, torturing me mercilessly. When I returned home, the tension in the air was palpable. Anna must have noticed something was wrong, but I didn't mention anything she had seen. Instead, I chose to wait and plan my revenge calmly. The betrayal was so deep that I felt I couldn't sit idly by. I needed to make them pay for their deception. I'd realized that justice wouldn't be enough. I wanted to see them suffer as much as I was. I began to devise an elaborate plan to make them pay for their actions, one that would plunge them into terror and despair. The next night, I followed my wife in the car to a jazz bar in the center of the city. She was dressed in a sensual outfit, very different from her usual style. I saw how she met Marta in the entrance, exchanging smiles and looking full of desire. How naive I felt. If I had seen that image 1,000 times before, it would never have crossed my mind that they had a secret relationship. I got out of the car and dressed in a raincoat and a hat. I decided to follow them into the bar. I didn't know what I was going to do when I saw them, but my body pushed me to confirm that my eyes hadn't deceived me that night. The inside of the bar was quite dark, but it wasn't difficult for me to find them. My heart pounded in my chest as I blended into the crowd, trying to blend in. The soft music and lights created a very romantic atmosphere. I sat in the corner, watching their every move. Then I reached into my pocket and noticed I had a knife. I didn't even remember when I had left it there. My mind was filled with a mixture of terror and anguish. How had our relationship gotten to that point? When I saw them putting on their coats to go out, I got ready to do it too. I followed them to their car and surprised them. I tied them violently with a sadistic smile on my face. I revealed to them all the evidence I had accumulated and promised them that they would suffer the same pain and humiliation that I had experienced. I took them home, and in the basement for days I subjected them to unimaginable physical and psychological torture. Their pleas and screams echoed between the four walls, but I was blinded by hatred and the thirst for revenge. The horror they experienced at my hands became an endless nightmare. I started by cutting my sister-in-law's hair. I shaved it to zero, leaving her bald. Then I continued with my wife. I looked at them with tears and asked them if they were still attracted to each other. But it was not enough for me. I continued cutting off one ear, so that they could no longer hear themselves, then several fingers, so that their dirty and treacherous hands could no longer be felt. I was ready to continue with the eyes, to take away the sight that had allowed them to meet and seduce each other. But I collapsed. Despite all that, the satisfaction I expected to feel never came. Instead, I found myself mired in an abyss of guilt and despair. What I had done hadn't brought me the peace I sought, but had worsened my own inner darkness. My hands were stained with blood. I didn't recognize myself. Finally, unable to bear the agony any longer, I decided to free them both. I would set them free, but their lives would be marked by the trauma I had inflicted on them. I knew they could never be the same again, just like me. I should have resolved it differently, told her things clearly, and let her go with another woman if that made her happy. My obsession with revenge had turned me into a monster, and now I was faced with the consequences of my actions. Trembling, the two cried and hacked each other with their bloody, fingerless hands, running their palms over each other's cheeks and telling each other that everything would be okay. I sat there, staring at them while they helped cover the bleeding that was getting bigger and bigger. When they were about to walk out of the door, Anna turned to look at me one last time, with hatred in her eyes, and I had to do it. I was selfish, yes. I couldn't stand the idea of the two of them rebuilding a happy life together, loving each other, while I rotted behind bars. Was I going to turn myself into the police? Yes. But at the last moment, I decided to grab a pen and paper and tell you this story and ask you, what would you have done? I grabbed my wife's corpse, caressed her head, so soft and hairless for the last time. She was still as beautiful as the day I met her. And hugging her, I shot my temple, ending my torment.
Years ago in Colombia, lived a couple that had two twin sons, Adam and Christopher, and even though they were identical on the outside, they had very different personalities. Adam helped his family as much as he could. He was a polite and respectful boy, and would also get the best grades in school. He was a great son. Meanwhile, his twin brother Christopher was exactly the opposite. His family would argue with him every day because of his disobedience. He neglected his schoolwork, insulted his teachers, and even got into physical fights often. His parents would always wonder how, despite receiving the same upbringing and education, their sons could be so different. Then, one day in his backyard, Christopher met with a group of friends who were fans of dark rituals and summoning games. Whenever he met with them, they would contact all kinds of spirits and otherworldly creatures. They usually used a Ouija board for that, but for this ritual that wouldn't be enough. They wanted to summon evil spirits, so they had to complete a number of challenges to do it successfully. Meanwhile, Adam was in his bedroom studying for an exam. He would sometimes look through the window to see what his brother was doing, but him and his friends would always hide behind a tree in the backyard. However, at one point he saw Sarah cross the garden, the girl he had a crush on. Adam immediately got up the chair and rushed downstairs. Christopher invited the young lady to meet with him, but she had no idea of his true intentions, offering her body to the beings of darkness he and his friends were going to summon. In his summoning book, it said that it was essential to offer a heart which was good, generous, and innocent, and Sarah had all of those qualities. Adam went into the yard and saw how the group chained Sarah up. He yelled at Christopher and ordered them all to unchain her and go home. He also tried to approach Sarah, but the group pushed him away. It's as if they were possessed and wouldn't stop repeating in unison, "The game is not over yet. The game is not over yet." Sarah started to cry and yell in horror. She was terrified and wanted to escape out of there. Christopher then grabbed a knife and cut the skin of the young lady's arm, making a line of blood flow from her wound. Seeing that, Adam started to fight the entire group. Unfortunately, they all hit him until he collapsed on the ground. They then kicked him while he was down, so he wouldn't have the strength to get back up. When they saw Adam no longer had the strength to interrupt the ritual, they held hands in a circle around Sarah and started to recite an incantation. She wouldn't stop crying and struggling, trying to free herself from the chains that tied her feet and hands. Adam noticed that a strong anger was starting to take a hold of him. He felt as if his veins were burning and how fury and hatred invaded his body. He took a deep breath, managed to get up, and grabbed the knife that Christopher had used before. Adam managed to stab all of Christopher's friends, one by one, leaving his brother for last. Adam approached Christopher, who for some reason didn't even try to escape. Adam looked directly into his brother's eyes and stabbed him in the heart. As Christopher was bleeding to death, his last words to Adam were, "The game is not over yet. One day, another soul will free me." Adam responded saying, "As long as my soul remains, I will not let you escape from hell. That will be your game." Adam unchained Sarah and told her to escape. The young lady rushed out of there, and just when she was about to get out of the yard, she looked back and saw Adam stab himself with the knife and fall on his knees. A year after what happened, Sarah still had not recovered from that horrible experience. That afternoon, she was about to be sacrificed as part of a satanic ritual, and then she witnessed how the boy she liked killed his brother and his friends, to then end his own life. She was sick of visiting the graveyard, spending afternoons with her psychologist, and taking sleeping pills. Every night she would see visions of Adam in her room, trapped with Christopher and his friends somewhere between life and death. They were all chained in some sort of limbo where Adam was constantly tormented as part of their demonic game. Adam sacrificed his life to save hers, so now it was her turn to do something to help him. Sarah started to study different books about witchcraft and invocations, and met with a group of young people who were fascinated about those subjects. She looked for ways to contact her friend, and once she had the people and the necessary materials to do it, she didn't hesitate to try. Sarah invited her new friends to her house and explained who were Christopher and Adam. She didn't want her friends to be deceived in any way, and they had to understand very well what was their mission: liberate Adam so he could finally rest in peace, and leave Christopher and his friends trapped in their twisted game. When Sarah's parents finally went out, the group started the ritual. They placed a lit candle on each window and started to recite a number of incantations. Then all of the candles in the house suddenly went out on their own. Christopher and his friends had started their game. Sarah looked everywhere and yelled, "I challenge you, Christopher!" She suddenly felt an intense headache. Christopher was chained in limbo, but that didn't prevent him from brutally attacking his opponents. Sarah's friends quickly lit all the candles again. Their light would help protect them from evil otherworldly beings. The next step was summoning Adam. Sarah stood in front of a mirror and said, "Adam, your brother's back." Suddenly, Sarah saw Adam right in front of her. He was chained by the feet and hands, just like she was on that fateful afternoon, and a few seconds later his face vanished. Sarah had explained the mission to all of her friends, but none of them knew the true risks of Christopher's game. Turns out she had to offer herself as a sacrifice once more. However, if she managed to free herself, she would save Adam so he could finally rest in peace. However, if she didn't manage to free herself, the sacrifice would exchange her soul for a chained soul. In other words, Sarah's soul would now be trapped between life and death, and Christopher would come back, thus winning his game. When everyone understood the danger Sarah was putting herself in, they all got extremely worried. But it was too late. They knew how dangerous it was to abandon the ritual without finishing it. There was no turning back. They started the first challenge. The group chained Sarah's feet and hands and made a cut on her arm. Then all the memories of that horrible afternoon came back to her. She was very scared, but was determined to win the game. The group then started to recite the necessary incantations, and suddenly the room felt bigger, and a thick fog started to invade it. Sarah's chains tightened. Now the spirits were the ones who had her chained. From the darkness, a crib with a baby appeared, but this baby was extremely strange. He had claws instead of nails, and blood was coming out of his mouth. In his hands there was a key, which was necessary to get to the next challenge. Sarah's group had to take the key from the baby without waking him up. If they did, the baby would slaughter them all. They managed to carefully get the key from him. Despite his claws, the baby seemed peaceful and defenseless. However, Sarah told them to kill the baby. It wasn't really alive, but it wasn't dead either. They had to free him from his earthly hell, so that nobody could ever do that challenge again. They all obeyed Sarah. They trusted her, and were convinced that she knew what she was doing. The moment they stabbed the little one in the heart, one of Sarah's chains fell to the floor. They overcame the first challenge. They were on the right track. Sarah had studied the ritual very well, and knew that the next challenge was one of the most complicated ones. The group started hearing noises in the kitchen. They saw several evil beings there, chained and eating at the kitchen table. They had to pass as other chained evil beings and get a secret code. In this challenge, Sarah's friends couldn't help her. If any of the chained spirits saw a mortal, they would try to kill them. Thus, Sarah had to pass as one of them and get the number they needed. She went in doing little jumps, since her chained feet didn't allow her to walk. There were several chained zombies in the kitchen, all of them enjoying the food on the table. Human flesh, to be precise. The stench was unbearable, but Sarah had to endure it and not raise suspicion. She sat on the last empty chair at the table and saw on her plate a child's hand. She couldn't help but gag. Noticing that, one of the zombies leered at her. Sarah couldn't let them discover her, so she lowered her head and bit the hand. When she started to chew, the zombie stopped looking at her and kept on eating. Sarah had to find the secret code as soon as possible. She didn't know how much longer she could stay there without throwing up. As she chewed on the hand's index finger, she saw that the plate of the zombie next to her had 4 numbers engraved on it. She couldn't see them clearly, so with a quick movement she pushed the food off the plate and managed to read the code, 3663. The zombie realized she was immortal and tried to alert the rest, but Sarah managed to headbutt him in the face. All the zombies stopped eating and stood up, but she yelled, "He's a human! He's a human! He's pretending to be one of us!" All the zombies plunged toward him, and she took advantage of the commotion to exit the kitchen with the code memorized. She went back to her group with one less chain, having completed the second challenge. All they had to do now was free Adam using the code and the key. Then, 2 chests appeared in front of them. One had written on it the number 3663. The other one said 6336. Sarah started feeling doubt. She was no longer sure if she remembered perfectly the combination of numbers. If she opened the wrong chest, all of their efforts would have been in vain, and her soul would be exchanged for Christopher's. Sarah closed her eyes and let her intuition choose. She pointed to one of the chests with her head and told her group to open it. They introduced the key, turned it, but the chest was empty. They were puzzled. Why was it empty? What did that mean?
The room fell into a deep silence. The friends who accompanied her trembled with fear, but no one dared to say a word. Suddenly, they could hear a voice. "You have fallen into my trap, Sarah. You have released my spirit, and now I am free to roam in search of revenge." It was Christopher. An icy wind began to blow, and the candles extinguished one by one, leaving everyone in complete darkness. Sarah's heartbeat quickened. Suddenly, her friends began to yell, but their voices sounded distant. She desperately searched for them in the dark, but they were no longer by her side. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that they had been dragged to another place by Christopher's spirit. She felt completely alone. Suddenly, a blurry, ghostly figure appeared in front of her. It was Adam, but his face was changed and his gaze was empty. Sarah realized he wasn't really him, but an illusion created by his brother's spirit. The false Adam reached out to her and said in a sinister voice, "Join us, Sarah. Join this eternal dance of terror and darkness. There is no escape for you." Sarah's heart was pounding, but she was filled with the strength and courage, rejecting the false Adam's offer and screaming with all her might, "I will not submit to you, Christopher. I will not let fear control me." The spirit roared in rage, and the room shook violently. Objects flew through the air, and the young woman struggled to stay on her feet. In the midst of the chaos, a memory from her childhood surfaced in her mind. It was a sacred place, an old abandoned chapel in the woods. She remembered the stories her late grandmother told her about the power of faith and the protection of the divine. Desperate, she called on the name of God and closed her eyes, trusting that someone would hear her. In an instant, everything stopped. The whirlwind subsided, and the room returned to normal. Sarah was no longer in the room. She was in the middle of the forest chapel. Candlelight flickered around her, and a feeling of peace and protection washed over her. Her grandmother, kneeling on one of the benches, kept her hands together in prayer and smiled at her. A tear fell down her cheek. It had been years since her grandmother had died, and seeing her again had moved her. But the calm was short-lived, and suddenly Christopher appeared at her side. The chapel seemed to tremble at his presence. You can't get away from me. Sarah looked around and found a wooden cross in the corner of the chapel. She walked over to it and held it firmly in her hands. Your power is great, Christopher, but you are not invincible, she said in a firm voice. Faith can be more powerful than any darkness. With a piercing cry, the young woman raised the cross towards the spirit. A brilliant light emanated from it, filling the chapel with a strong glow. Christopher writhed and screamed in pain, unable to bear the divine presence. Sarah closed her eyes and said a silent prayer, trusting that God would protect her. When she opened them again, she was back in the same room as before. The place was silent once more, and the candles were burning again. Sarah was exhausted, but also relieved to see that she had managed to repel Christopher. With shaky steps, she approached the chests again. She didn't know if she really had passed the challenge or if all that had happened was another illusion created by the vengeful spirit. However, this time she did not hesitate. She selected the chest with the combination 6336 and with shaking hands inserted the key. To her surprise and relief, the chest opened, revealing a bright light within. Sarah had to squeeze her eyes shut. When she finally opened them, she saw something move inside the mirror. It was Adam, unchained with his serene, calm gaze. He had been released. Adam smiled weakly and said softly, "Thank you for saving me, my friend." Sarah felt tears fill her eyes as she touched her fingers to the mirror, as if trying to grasp at his. Finally, she had achieved what she longed for, to free Adam's soul from the darkness. Meanwhile, Christopher was still trapped in some dark corner with no way out. He had lost his game and his soul was doomed to wander forever in the darkness he himself had sought. She had managed to save her friend, but the price had been high. Her new friends who had accompanied her on that dangerous mission were lost somewhere between life and death, victims of those sinister games. Suddenly she heard a whisper. He was Christopher again. "Don't you dare celebrate your victory, Sarah. I will continue to haunt you in your nightmares. You will never escape me." Sarah's eyes filled with determination. She knew she couldn't allow Christopher's spirit to haunt her forever. Trembling inside, she steeled herself and faced the darkness. "I am no longer afraid of you, Christopher. Light and faith will protect me from your attempts at revenge. I will not yield to your threats." The atmosphere became even more oppressive, but Sarah didn't back down. She clutched the cross she had brought with her from the abandoned chapel and began to recite a prayer. Brilliant light emanated from the cross, creating a protective barrier around her and Adam. Christopher's spirit howled in rage and tried to unsettle her with terrifying and distorted images. But Sarah didn't give in to the hallucinations. She closed her eyes and concentrated on her faith. Little by little, Christopher's evil presence weakened, unable to penetrate the barrier of light Sarah had created. The vengeful spirit became a distant whisper, and finally, he disappeared into the darkness. When Sarah opened her eyes, the atmosphere had returned to normal. The room was quiet and serene, with no sign of Christopher's spirit. Her friends hugged her tightly. They were back! Sarah turned to the mirror, and there she could see Adam's reflection, who looked at her with gratitude and relief. "You did it. You beat Christopher and you pushed him away. Thank you for saving me. Now I can rest." She smiled, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment, although her heart was filled with sadness knowing that she would never see him again. She knew that she had done the right thing in freeing his soul. Although the nightmare was over, the memory of those events would remain in the young woman's heart forever. Thus, the story of the brave Sarah who faced the darkness became a legend of terror that would remain in the memory of the residents of that town in Colombia. Hi, my name is Paula and I'm 9 years old. I'm a very lucky girl because I'm lucky to have a twin sister. Her name is Andrea. We always do everything together. We study, we play, we walk. Although I have to confess one thing to you. My little sister has a somewhat dark side that I don't like. She enjoys doing harm to animals. She rips out their legs, their eyes. She ends up killing them, and that amuses her. One day, for example, we were playing in the area of a river near our house. Suddenly, I saw my sister, who was crouching down and plotting something. When I got closer to her, I could see that she was tearing the heart out of a poor little bird. I yelled at her and asked her to stop, but she didn't listen. I tried to snatch it away, and we both ended up falling into the river. Shortly after, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was at home. I didn't remember what had happened. My parents asked me to rest. I had drowned in the water. Luckily, they found us. My mother came out of my room sobbing, probably from fright. And right after, my sister walked in. She told me that she was very worried about me. She was glad to see me awake at last. Within a few days, everything was back to normal. Well, not exactly the same, no. They no longer let us leave the house alone, nor go near the river. Although we used to sneak away. My sister continued with her usual antics. Her latest exploits consisted of putting food on the road and causing animals such as cats or dogs to be run over. Furthermore, this was the cause of several car accidents. The police began to investigate who was behind it from what I saw on the news. Andrea made me promise not to tell anyone. And I didn't. I didn't want her to go to jail, of course. We were talking about it when our mother came into the room. Afraid in case she had heard her, my sister hid behind the door. Mom asked who I was talking to, and I told her I was talking to myself. The truth is that I hid it very well because she didn't find out. At that moment, she told me that I was going to have a new baby brother. She was pregnant. I was very happy and hugged her. But who was not amused by his news was my twin sister. She was very jealous and angry. She began to throw everything on the floor, breaking dolls and toys. Time passed and my sister continued to do bad things. She tried over and over again to make our mother lose the baby. When our parents asked me who did it, I never blamed Andrea because I didn't want to be punished, and in the end, they scolded me. The last of her pranks was the worst. She made our mother fall down the stairs when her belly was already huge. I went down crying to help her, and at that moment, my father came in and asked me what I had done to her. I told him that it hadn't been me. It was Andrea's thing. She had thrown her away. My father, with a pale face, told me that my little sister had died in the river. Suddenly, all the memories began to come to my mind. That fateful day, Andrea had died and only I had been saved. My imagination made me see her always with me because I was not prepared to part with her. All those antics, it had been me. I put food on the road so that the animals died. I had tried to make my mother lose the baby. The death of my sister made me create a double personality, the good and the bad. When she died, I took her role, even though I had overstepped the bounds. That's what my doctor told me. They locked me up, but I managed to escape from the center and went back to my house, where my parents were with that baby who had stolen my place. Andrea whispered to me, "Come on, come in." And then we entered the house through the back door. They were happy. They left us locked up and abandoned. When the baby was left alone, we went into the room and covered his face with a pillow. But Dad came in. Now there are 2 graves where my parents cried. It's not my new little brother's. He didn't die. It was me. But now Andrea is waiting for me, and I will always have her love, the greatest I've ever had between sisters. It was midnight on November 14th, 1995. A bus had just departed from the old Summer Palace terminal in Beijing and was heading to Xianshan. Aboard were just 2 people, a man at the wheel and a woman as his co-driver. The bus first stopped at the southern door of the ancient Summer Palace, which was the official residence of the Qing Dynasty emperors, before it was destroyed by British soldiers in 1860. 4 people boarded the bus, an elderly woman, a young couple, and a boy. The bus then kept advancing. After passing in front of the northern door of the palace, the driver saw 2 shadows moving in the highway. That wasn't an official stop, so he wasn't allowed to stop the bus there. However, it was so late that the driver felt pity for those people, so he decided to stop the bus and open a door. 3 people went in. They were 3 men, although one of them seemed to be very drunk and was being held by the other 2. Nobody could see his face because his head was bent forward all the way, not to mention he also looked dirty and unkempt. For some reason, the 3 men were wearing traditional tunics from the Qin dynasty era. And they also seemed to be wearing some sort of makeup since their skin was looking extremely pale. They sat in the back of the bus and remained completely silent. The other passengers looked at each other with worried expressions, thinking about how strange those men looked. However, the co-driver reassured the passengers by telling them that those men were probably actors who just came out of shooting a film. She was sure they went drinking after shooting, and that's why they were wearing those clothes. That explanation calmed everyone down, except the elderly woman, who couldn't avoid looking at them every now and then. 4 stops later, the young couple got off the bus. Now there were only the drivers, the old woman, and the boy. And in that very moment, the old woman started to scream, saying that the boy just stole money from her. The boy, who didn't understand what was happening, tried to reason with her, but couldn't calm her down. She then asked the driver to stop the bus at the next stop to take the boy to the police. And the boy, who didn't actually take any money from the old woman, accepted to go with her out of politeness. The driver did as he was told, and both the old woman and the boy got off the bus. And as soon as they did, and saw the bus drive away, the elderly woman turned towards the boy and told him, "I just saved your life." He still didn't understand anything and thought that woman was completely crazy. But she wasn't so. She explained to him that those 3 men with tunics were actually ghosts. Observing them, she realized that under those tunics they actually had no legs. The boy didn't know if he should believe those words or not, but the next day he learned the truth. The bus number 375 didn't go back to base that night, and the next morning, all the news outlets opened talking about the disappearance of both drivers in the vehicle. When they saw the news, the boy and the old woman informed the authorities about what happened. But the police didn't believe them and sent them home. However, the next day, the bus was found sunk in a reservoir located 100 kilometers away from the original route. And inside, they discovered 3 bodies in an advanced state of decomposition: the driver, the co-driver, and a 3rd unidentified person. How was it possible for their bodies to decompose so fast in just a single day? And why did the bus end up so far from its original route? Hey there, TikTokers! The ghost bus is a famous urban legend that has different versions in China, as well as different versions in other countries. The Mexican version of this story is pretty scary too, so if you're interested, let us know in the comments and we'll make a video about it. In China, this legend can have different protagonists. In one version, instead of 3 men wearing traditional tunics, the ghost is a woman wearing red. In another version, when the police finds the bus, the gas tank is filled with blood. And the number of the bus also changes. In any case, it is good to be familiar with this legend so you can react if you're ever taking a bus during the wee hours of the night and someone suspicious gets in. Better safe than sorry, right, TikTokers?
Laura had activated the camera and started recording. She began recording the introduction of the report that was scheduled to be broadcast on television the next day. All the network workers had gone home. She was left alone on the set. She had promised everyone that she would close the door as soon as she was done. I watched her from the side of the curtains, hidden, until I saw her start recording. It was my turn. Suddenly, I appeared in front of the camera, hooded, and grabbed her from behind, covering her mouth and throwing her to the ground. Everything had been recorded. I stopped the camera, covered her eyes and mouth, and took her away, holding her tightly with ropes. We entered a basement, and at that moment I untied her and took off the blindfold. Immediately, we melted into a passionate kiss. "Have I hurt you a lot, darling?" I asked her, afraid that I had squeezed her too hard with the ropes. "Don't worry, this way everything will be more believable. We need to make it look like I've been hurt." We laughed and gave each other a hug. All that was left was to wait for everyone to know the news of her disappearance. The next day, the television station where Laura worked published the video she had recorded minutes before her alleged abduction. The channel's most veteran star, journalist Sandra Cruz, had once again captured all the audience's attention with the biggest exclusive of the moment. The best news always went to her, as well as the greatest number of minutes on screen. Although she wasn't the owner, she behaved like another boss. The audience loved her, and the director and herself knew that. But her moment as a star was very close to being affected. I headed to the basement where Laura was to check on her. I offered her food and water, but she refused to eat anything. She told me that she had to look bad to make it look real, so she decided not to eat anything. I didn't like that. It is true that this way it was easier for everything to be more realistic, but I didn't like that she could get sick by going that far with it. She asked me how the news was going in the media, and I told her that all the channels were talking about it. Her eyes shone in a special way. She was full of joy. The plan was going as we had devised. A day later, the news of Laura's disappearance was going around the world, but a video was beginning to overshadow it. And once again, the protagonist was her, Sandra Cruz, the #1 journalist. In one of the broadcasts where she told the viewers about the progress of her partner's investigation, she appeared visually very affected, unable to contain her tears when she pronounced Laura's name. Without being the victim, her appearance was once again the highlight of the day. All social networks were talking about her emotional video, with words of encouragement towards the sad journalist. Of course, Laura had to know that, and that afternoon I went back to the basement to see her. Her eyes were covered and she had left some ropes squeezing her wrists together. She insisted a lot that we should do it that way, to continue adding evidence of how bad she had been. When I told her about Sandra's video, she got in a very bad mood. She decided it was time to move on to the next part of the plan, and so we did it. I put her in the trunk of the car, and then left her with her hands tied and blindfolded on a secondary road with little traffic. Very few cars passed there. There were no cameras or witnesses. We immersed ourselves in a deep hug, and I left her in that place alone. I had to stay away because they couldn't connect me with her. Half an hour later, a truck passed by that road and found her lost and disoriented. The truck driver approached her and quickly called the police. The kidnapped reporter had appeared, and she was alive. Laura knew very well how she should play her cards. So from her hospital room, she called her boss, the director of the network, and told him that she was safe. As soon as the news broke, all the reporters would wait at the doors of the hospital to have the long-awaited exclusive. That was super news, and whoever had the first images would get the most views. So her boss thanked her for her discretion to give them the scoop, thanking her for her professionalism as a journalist with the company. A few minutes later, Sandra Cruz appeared in her hospital room with Mike, the cameraman. There was a rivalry between them. Laura wasn't happy to see her, and Sandra didn't hide her lack of joy that she had appeared. As soon as Mike counted down to go live, the two of them drastically changed their expressions. Sandra seemed extremely hurt and excited about the reunion with her partner, but at that moment, the camera belonged to Laura. What people wanted was to see her, hear her, know what miseries she had suffered. The two reporters' stellar moments didn't last long, as suddenly the police entered the room and forced all the TV workers to leave. They shouldn't have recorded anything. The police should have been the first to talk to the victim. But they already had it, a super exclusive for the channel. Well, after having told you all this, I think it's time for me to explain who I am and why I did this with Laura. She was my journalism student. I am a professor at the university, and I remembered that she was the most brilliant student who passed through my class. She had a vocation. Above all, what she liked most was being in front of the camera. She loved capturing everyone's attention. I am married, but it is true that my marriage is not going through its best moment. Maybe that was the reason why Laura and I went little by little from a purely professional relationship between teacher and student to a sentimental one. I was wrong, I know. You can judge me for it, but I felt like we had a lot in common. It went beyond a simple attraction. We both shared that ambition to grab the headlines, to be the best in our profession. I loved listening to her speak with such passion about her work, and so we began a secret relationship. After finishing her university studies, she was given a job on regional television as a reporter. She was overjoyed, so many people watching her, paying attention to her reports and interviews. However, she soon fell short, as she couldn't compete with the channel's superstar, Sandra Cruz. I told her not to worry about it. Sandra had been on the air for many years. It was normal that she had the affection of viewers and bosses, but her work was also incredible. They also adored her. But no, for her, that had to change, and that's how she devised a plan, to fake her own kidnapping, and when she was released, all eyes would focus on her. First, as a victim, of course, and then as the reporter who, despite the adversities and what she had suffered, continued on the air offering viewers the best news. She was sure that the boss would start giving the exclusives to her. Everyone would want to see her after her misfortune. Well, as I was telling you, the plan had gone as planned. A couple of days after being in the hospital and the exclusive of her appearance, all the media were waiting for her at the main door to record her. She pretended to be overwhelmed by so much attention. I really don't know what to say. Today it is my turn to be your news, dear colleagues. I wish I didn't have to see myself in these circumstances, but if I can take something good from all the terror I have experienced, it is that I've seen many people on the other side of the screen have shown me their love. I feel very lucky to be alive. Afterwards, she walked crying to her car, while hundreds of flashes chased her. The first few days, most of the news was programmed around her testimony, telling what she had suffered, what she had felt, the clues that could lead to the culprit. But soon, Sandra Cruz took care to make the head of the network understand that Laura's news no longer mattered. There was no more information, no suspects. It was the same story over and over again. The director agreed with Sandra because the topic had stalled. They needed freshness, new and attractive news to attract the audience. When Laura saw that everything was returning to normal, she began to get unhinged. She couldn't stand Sandra getting her way. That's why she told me that we had to take one more step. I asked her what she thought, but she just smiled as she caressed my face. It was clear that she already had something on her mind. Then, she asked me to grab my camera and take photos from the street to her window while she undressed and put on her pajamas. She needed those photos, and soon, I would find out why. The next day, she had to record a news story with Mike, one of the cameramen. The two of them had some trust. They had once spent the night together. And although that didn't go further and they never had a relationship, she knew that he was still in love with her. That day, she seemed a little sad and down, and Mike asked her if everything was okay. Laura confessed that she couldn't feel calm and that she was afraid when she was alone. She needed a friend, and Mike offered to spend the afternoon together at his house after work. She accepted. It was just what she wanted. When they arrived, the two began talking about the past, from their adolescence, their boyfriends, their tastes. Mike was very comfortable with her. He liked her, but he didn't want to ruin their friendship. If Laura didn't show that she wanted something more with him, he wouldn't insist. After her tragic experience, what she needed was calm, not radical changes in her life. He offered her a coffee and she accepted. When he placed 2 cups on the table, Laura asked him for some sugar. While he went to the kitchen, she took a bottle from her purse and poured several drops of the liquid into the young man's cup. When Mike returned, he drank his coffee without suspecting anything and soon fell asleep. She had given him a sleeping pill. She took advantage of his deep sleep to carry out her plan. She posted the photos that she had asked me to photograph, with her back naked through the window in one of Mike's drawers. Then she grabbed a knife, made a small cut on her hand, and stained the cuff of the young man's jacket with her blood. When she finished, she grabbed her bag and left the house, leaving the cameraman sleeping soundly until the next day. When Mike woke up, he was disoriented. He didn't remember when Laura had left there and how he had fallen asleep for so many hours on the couch. He didn't have time to shower or have breakfast. It was late. He should have arrived at work half an hour ago. He grabbed his jacket and headed to the network's sets. When he arrived, he saw his boss and Laura talking to the police. He approached to find out what had happened, but at that moment, one of the agents approached him and, putting handcuffs on him, told him that he was detained for the kidnapping of his partner, Laura. Mike couldn't believe what was happening. He yelled at her, assuring her that he hadn't done anything, while the agents dragged him to the exit to take him to the cell. The network director hugged Laura and told her she could go home and take the day off if she needed. But she assured him that all she wanted was to give the world the scoop on who had kidnapped her. She needed to do it, and her boss, of course, didn't object. Once again, she was the center of all the headlines. The young reporter who discovers that her attacker was a coworker. She said that he had taken her to his house and that he insisted a lot that he always wanted to be with her. At first, it seemed normal to her until several clues made her relate that it could be him, since she had received secret notes with handwriting like his. Then, at one point, she found some photos of her without clothes in his room, spying on her through the window from the street. She wasn't even able to take them, so she tried to get out of there and went directly to the police to tell them her suspicions. When the agents arrived, they found the photos, and not only that, also bloodstains on the young man's jacket. By performing laboratory tests, they were able to certify that it was Laura's blood. Everything fell into place, and that young man would go to prison for many years for a crime he had never committed. But for her, the important thing was that she had ousted Sandra on screen. People wanted to know their history. When I discovered everything she had done, I was angry. I didn't want to be complicit in something like that. I had agreed to give her the whim of being the center of attention with a fake kidnapping, but the idea of an innocent person going to jail for that game of lies went against my principles. So I decided to tell her and ask her to solve the mess. As you can imagine, she didn't want to do it. She laughed while telling me that this was perfect because they would never suspect that everything had been pure theater. If there was a culprit, there was always going to be a real victim, and she could continue to make the news. And she could even write books recounting her experience as a survivor of such a traumatic episode. Laura was very happy with how her work career was evolving. Instead of looking hurt and traumatized, she walked through the corridors of the network with an air of grandeur and stardom. And who didn't go unnoticed was her great opponent, Sandra Cruz. The journalists suspected that there was something strange. She didn't trust her, and her way of behaving made her think she was hiding a big secret. So, as a good journalist, she did what she did best: investigate and find that exclusive she needed. She found out the secret relationship that Laura and I had. I didn't know it at the time, but he followed me several times when I went to her house and saw us kissing. There she had the first thread to pull, an unfaithful and secret relationship that no one knew about. Laura knew that the journalist was following her and angrily showed up at her house. Sandra told her that she didn't have to explain herself, she was just doing her job, but Laura wasn't going to stay still. She left that house thinking about what her next step would be. The next day, the police were at Sandra's house. Someone had entered there and left everything destroyed inside. Broken vases, cushions on the floor. Everything seemed to indicate that someone had entered and taken the journalist. Laura had everything she wanted again. Her great rival was out of the game. Since being missing, she would replace her in all the news. She was obsessed and wished that Sarah would never appear again. She told me that if they found her, she herself would make her disappear again, forever. I felt chills at her words, because I knew she meant it. Then I threatened her by telling her that I was going to tell everything to the police. She angrily told me that if I did it, she would end me. I answered that no one was going to stop me, and suddenly she took a gun out of her bag, shot me in the heart, and I fell to the ground. She didn't even check my pulse and ran out of there before anyone found my body. Because I knew her so well, I knew she could reach that limit, and I was cautious by putting a bulletproof vest under my sweater. Although I have to say, the bullet didn't go through me, but the impact hurt me quite a bit. I secretly went to the place where Laura was supposed to make a live connection from the street. When she appeared on the air, everything seemed normal, until suddenly Sandra appeared on scene and stood in front of the cameras, revealing and telling all of Laura's secrets, her false kidnapping, the manipulated evidence. She, motionless, didn't know what to do. The camera was recording her. Everyone from their homes was listening to Sandra's confession, who was forced to simulate her own kidnapping in order to catch her. Laura looked everywhere. She didn't know how to get out of there. They had caught her, and suddenly, her eyes met mine. Behind the cameraman were me, Mike, and the police. We had an agreement, and I had told them the whole truth. Laura had lost.
If you have started this video, it is because you're needing your weekly dose of terror. Today, we find it in Cádiz, a province in southern Spain. Specifically, we are going to a house next to the monument of the Marqués de Comillas. Today, that house is uninhabited, but several centuries ago, a ship captain lived in it with a beautiful daughter. She was what he loved the most in the world. When he was on land, they spent a lot of time together, and every time he returned from his travels, he brought her a mirror as a gift. She collected them, and each time she was enlarging her valuable treasure. But her mother was jealous of her because she didn't receive the same treatment from her husband. She often told her husband that she needs to feel loved, but his behavior didn't change, and she felt that affection was not enough. For this reason, taking advantage of one of the men's trips, she poisoned her daughter. She went to a village witch to give her a mixture to add to her food. In this way, the young woman didn't find out anything and died after eating when she was in her mirrored room. The mother buried her and sent notice to her husband, who, when he found out, he changed his course to run home. When he arrived, she told him that the girl had fallen ill and she had died in a few days. She lied, saying that despite trying, no one had been able to do anything for her. Her husband, crying for hours, could not believe that he had been so unlucky. His little girl was gone forever. Nevertheless, the mother didn't know that the room of mirrors had recorded everything that happened. When the father entered there, the mirrors replicated the scene and he could see that his wife was responsible. He also saw how she had treated his daughter's body, doing all kinds of misdeeds. The scene was terribly macabre, but he remained without moving, without saying anything, under the watchful eye of his wife, who couldn't believe what she was seeing. That silence was witness to the tension in the environment. The father was still silent, but he was thinking about how to get revenge. In the end, very angry, he locked his wife in the castle dungeons. There, he left her without food or drink, and she ended up dying. He didn't want to be in that place anymore, so he left his home and settled forever in his boat. He never set foot on land again. But that house never forgot what happened. For this reason, people said that those mirrors continue to replicate the terrible scene of the murder of a beautiful young woman at the hands of her mother. Be careful if you go there, because you can see things that you will never want to remember. There are people who need risk and adrenaline to live. That was the case of Lucas, Alba, Julio, and Sebastián. They had studied criminology together, but soon realized that what they liked was something else. It also had to do with mysteries, but with some more inexplicable ones. They became friends in their first year of college, and in their second year they already shared all kinds of plans. This is how they discovered a ghost hunting YouTuber. At first they made meetings to watch their reports. He traveled all over the world trying to record or hear something supernatural, and they were amazed by each of his videos. But soon, seeing them was not enough, and they wanted to take action. They started with locations near their town. The abandoned monastery, the cemetery, and some of them they thought they saw things, but the truth is that they had no way to prove it. Perhaps it was simply their desire to experience extreme sensations that led them to think that they had seen ghosts. But everything changed when they traveled 300 kilometers from their homes to spend the night in an abandoned Burger King. They had found several articles claiming that terrible things had happened there. Several people had died in unexplained conditions in the surrounding area, and no YouTuber had dared to enter there. It wasn't just any Burger King. It had several floors, a games area, large rooms for parties. The urban legends about the paranormal events that occurred there were so many that even the neighbors who lived nearby moved to other towns, and the area had been practically deserted. The idea of researching there excited them so much that they spent 3 weeks preparing everything. They spent all their savings on cameras with night vision, powerful microphones, and even a knife to defend themselves if necessary. They knew that a knife would be of little use to them when facing a ghost, but it was also because of the feeling of protection that the object generated in them. With everything ready, they decided to print a map on the premises and draw up a plan. The plan was that one of them would stay outside, watching, and with a cell phone ready to call and ask for help. He would do it from the car in case they had to flee in a hurry. No one wanted to stay in the vehicle, so they would do 2 shifts and draw lots. The others would be together all the time. They wouldn't be separated for absolutely anything. They told their parents that they were going to a rural house for the weekend, and they left. They had to spend a fortune on gasoline, but they didn't care because they were going to carry out their first real mission. When they got there, it was practically night. They grabbed all their equipment and Lucas, Alba, and Julio prepared to enter while Sebastián took the first watch in the car. When Alba touched the doorknob, she thought she had never felt so good in her life. She was so excited. But right when she opened it, everything became terrifying. Although none of them said anything, that dirty environment full of broken tables and chairs and with multiple graffiti on the walls caused them real panic. There was no trace of the colorful and cheerful atmosphere of its current premises. Some partitions had been knocked down, so the idea they had developed following their plan couldn't be carried out. They chatted for a moment about the next step to take, and the 3 decided to inspect the upstairs first. Julio had the camera recording from minute 0. Alba had a smaller one, and the 3 of them had several activated microphones. Lucas grabbed a fairly powerful flashlight. The first area they entered looked like a games room. There were many balls and dolls on the floor, and they were all missing something. Some without an arm, others without a leg. The walls were stained with moisture and with some indecipherable marks. But they didn't see anything else. They continued and wanted to enter the second room, the one that corresponded to the event area, but it seemed blocked. That didn't make sense because it didn't have a hole for a key, and no one could lock it from the inside because the place was completely abandoned. Julio then remembered that they had a lever in the car, with which they could open it. He changed the camera to Alba so that she could keep the good one, and he left. He went down the stairs as fast as he could, so fast that he didn't notice that something seemed to be moving right behind him. He opened the front door and then waved to Sebastián. Surprised, he asked him what he was doing there. Julio explained what happened and ran to the back door to grab the lever. At that moment, Sebastián let out a scream as he looked at the front door. "Record with the camera! There is a man!" Julio turned around very quickly, but he didn't see anything. He told Sebastián that he must have seen something wrong and went back up with his companions. But while they were trying to open the door upstairs, they heard the car start up and make a lot of noise, as if someone was speeding it up as much as possible. They thought something had happened, so they went down to check. And sure enough, they found Sebastián behind the wheel. Blood was coming out of his nose and ears, and he didn't say a single word. He was in a kind of hypnosis. He didn't respond to them or let them touch him. He was gripping the steering wheel so hard that his hands were already completely purple, and the car would start burning at any moment if he didn't stop pressing the accelerator. At that same moment, they heard the door slam inside the premises, even the one at the entrance. It was clear that something strange was happening, but at that moment, the most important thing was to try to get Sebastian to recover. Lucas got into the passenger seat and managed to turn off the car and take the keys, but Sebas still wouldn't let them touch him. It took almost an hour for Alba to convince him. So they put him in the back seat and drove home. Since he didn't react, they decided to go to a hospital, and once there, they admitted him to intensive care due to a serious concussion. That was the last day that the three friends saw Sebas. They learned that he had left the hospital, but he never wanted to speak to them again. His family told him that he didn't want to leave the house and barely spoke to anyone. And upon reviewing the tapes, they themselves had seen that their friend was not lying. There was a man at the entrance to the Burger King when Julio came back up. After that incident, the three of them spent a while without visiting any haunted place. They were sad because they had lost a friend and they were still scared. Even so, they still wanted to explore that place thoroughly. And the first one who dared to verbalize it was Lucas. A year after his first excursion to the abandoned Burger King, he said, "I think we should try again." Alba's eyes lit up. She remembered the sensation of vertigo and at the same time excitement that she had felt when entering there. She wanted that, but Julio was much more hesitant. He felt guilty for not having believed Sebastian. Perhaps if he had stayed with him, nothing would have happened, and the four of them would continue to be friends as always. But they had to make a decision, and in the end, they ended up convincing him. They hadn't done anything like this in a year, but they kept all the equipment. They also didn't know if the place was as still as they had seen it the last time. But they had already learned that in these cases, planning may be of no use. They marked a day and prepared for a new adventure. Along the way, the three of them had doubts. Their parents didn't know where they were going, otherwise they wouldn't have let them leave the house. After what happened with Sebastian, no one wanted to hear about that abandoned hamburger restaurant. No one, except them, who were eager to cross that door again. And in doing so, nothing seemed to have changed. All the doors were closed, and they went back up the stairs to start upstairs. On this occasion, none of the three was left out. They had decided not to separate. The first area remained the same. The dolls were on the floor and nothing seemed to have moved from its place. They continued down the hallway and found that the second door was still locked. But this time, they were more prepared and had the leverage. Julio and Lucas tried to open it using all possible force, but there was no way. It was completely blocked. They tried for a long time, and then Alba decided that she had to go down the mountain. Only then would they be able to open that place. Her companions insisted that she couldn't go down alone, so the three of them went to the car to look for her. When they went up, when they were about to start cutting the wood of the door, Alba placed her hand on the knob again, and suddenly the door opened. It seemed like magic. They had recently been hidden it and had achieved nothing. She was the first to enter to inspect everything, and just as she walked through the door, it slammed shut again. Her companions stayed on the other side, very scared and trying to open it again. Just a few seconds later, Alba began to scream, "There's a man! There is a man!" Her screams were of terror. She asked for help and hit the door. Her companions began to cut the wood, but Alba's screams became louder and louder until they heard, "No!" And everything went silent. Julio sped up the saw as much as he could, and when he managed to open a hole, they saw it. Alba's body was on top of a pool of blood. She had a knife stuck in her heart. The two young men stood completely paralyzed. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. They completely broke the door and entered the room. They looked everywhere, looking for who could be responsible for that tragedy. But there was absolutely no one. They quickly dialed the emergency number, but there was no signal. Julio went out of the garden with his cell phone in his hand while Lucas stayed with Alba. He couldn't stop looking at her. She wasn't breathing, and her heart wasn't beating. He couldn't believe it. And suddenly, a scream from Julio brought him out of his thoughts. He ran downstairs to see what was happening, and then he saw how his friend was in the same situation as Sebastian. Hands on the wheel and the accelerator pressed. This time, the car wasn't braked, so in a matter of seconds, he saw his friend crash into a wall next to him. Lucas ran to the car, desperate to snap Julio out of his trance, but the doors were locked. He knew he had no time to waste, so he returned to the store in search of something he could use to break the glass. Trembling, he searched desperately through the rubble and the remains of abandoned furniture. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he screamed over and over again inside. "Please, Julio, please don't leave me." Finally, his eyes landed on a piece of twisted iron, an ancient rusty object that looked solid enough to break the car window. He grabbed it and hurried back to the vehicle. A cry of effort, he hit the glass with all his might, again and again, until it finally shattered into 1,000 pieces. Without wasting a second, he reached inside the car and opened the door. Then he grabbed Julio, dragging him outside. But when he had it in his arms, Lucas' heart sank as he realized it was too late. Julio was cold and lifeless, his empty eyes staring into nothingness. There was nothing he could do for him. A wave of terror washed over him as he dropped his friend's body to the ground. Then in the midst of his pain, his head began to relate when those misfortunes had happened. First Sebastián, then Alba, then Julio. He realized that every time they separated, something terrible happened to them. At that moment, he was alone, and he knew that he could be the next to suffer an unexplained paranormal death. Fear enveloped him as he made a desperate decision. He knew he should call the police, but he also knew he needed to hide until they arrived. If whatever had caused Julio to crash was out, there he was in danger. So he decided to run up to the play area where the dolls were, unable to face the place where Alba's lifeless body still lay. As he entered the room, his eyes fell on the damp stains on the wall. He approached slowly, watching as the shapes seemed to shift and morph before his eyes. And then, as if it were a flash of clarity in the middle of the darkness, he saw letters. The names of Alba and Julio were written there in the stains. His body shook as he realized what it meant. He realized he needed help, someone who could understand what was happening. Despite everything that had happened between them, Sebastián was the only person who could help him understand the truth behind it all. He hadn't wanted to speak to them again after what he had experienced at the burger, and his horrible situation accelerating the car, but he had to help him to survive. With trembling hands, he took out his phone and dialed Sebastián's number. His heart was pounding as he waited for someone to answer on the other end of the line. And then a familiar voice took his breath away. They were Seba's parents, but what they said left him paralyzed. Sebastián had taken his own life, jumping from the window of his apartment. The parents, between sobs, told him that they were at the wake. Lucas couldn't believe what he was hearing. His friend had always been strong. What had led him to do something like that? Just when he thought he couldn't feel more terrified, suddenly he saw a new stain appear on the wall that said, Sebastián. He would not allow the moment of his death to come. Not that day. He looked everywhere, shouting, "Where are you? Come out of your hiding place. If you're gonna kill me, come out and show your face. I'm not afraid of you. I will take revenge for taking all my friends away." But nothing appeared around him. He continued inspecting the place and went down to the top floor. And then, in the distance, he saw a flash of lights. He didn't know where to escape. If that ghost or spirit was outside, he would catch him, but if he stayed there, he would die cornered. He closed his eyes tightly and finally decided to face his destiny and go outside. Whatever happened, it would be the last time he would step on that Burger King floor. Suddenly, he recognized the source of light. It was an ambulance and the police behind it, coming to help him after his emergency call. He felt relieved, but as he noticed, he heard how, inside the premises, all the doors slammed shut again. It was clear that someone didn't want anyone to go in there. The sad thing is that it had taken him and his friends too long to realize it. Today, we'll be sharing with you the story of Mike, a young guy who was never the same after experiencing the events you're about to hear. Mike was a peaceful guy, the stereotypical obedient lad who never got into trouble and was a good son that every parent wishes they could have. Meanwhile, his best friend Lily, who was also his neighbor, was quite the opposite. She used lots of swear words, would run away from home to be with her friends, was disobedient, However, Lily would behave very differently with Mike. When she was with him, she was sweet and affectionate. She would also stand up to anyone who tried to pick on Mike and would always help him in everything he needed. Actually, they were both in love with each other, but none of them was brave enough to make the first move. The previous weeks, Lily had a lot of issues with her parents. They were very religious and they had grounded her on numerous occasions due to doing things that went against God's will. To Mike, Lily's family was more like a sect. They only wanted to interact with people who believed precisely what they believed, and those who didn't think like them were all sinners. Lily's situation got even worse when, after a very fierce argument with her parents, she screamed something that to them would be considered abhorrent. Basically, besides the insults and swear words, she screamed that she didn't believe in any God and spit on a Bible right in front of them. Mike could hear the screams even from his house. He looked out the window to try to see what was going on, but with no luck. He then decided to go out to the yard to wait for his friend. After being grounded, she would always escape through the guest room window. Mike waited for hours, but she was still inside her house. Suddenly, Mike saw a priest who started knocking on Lily's house. He wasn't the town's priest. Mike had never seen him before. Lily's mother opened the door and invited the priest to come in. Lily's screams coming from inside the house started becoming more and more intense. She was no longer just screaming, but weeping uncontrollably as well. Mike was desperate. He didn't know what to do to help her. If he rang the doorbell, her parents wouldn't let him come in. For them, Mike was a heretic who had instilled bad thoughts into their daughter's mind. Lily kept on screaming. Mike thought about calling the police, but he would need to have evidence that they were actually doing something bad to her. Were they hurting her? Mike wasn't sure. Why would a priest participate in hurting a girl? Suddenly, Mike had an idea. He remembered the guest room's window. He jumped the wall that separated the yard of both houses and tried to open the window. Unfortunately, Lily had left it open. He jumped inside and very carefully tiptoed to the door to hear better. His friend kept on screaming with heart-wrenching intensity. "Let me go! You have no right to do this to me! Let me go!" she cried. At the same time, the priest and her parents were reciting verses that sounded like prayers. Mike finally realized what they were doing to her. They were carrying out an exorcism ritual. Mike jumped out of his hiding place and burst into the room where Lily was being held. She was tied to her bed with ropes and her eyes were whited out. The priest was pointing a crucifix at Lily while drizzling her with holy water. Lily's mother turned around when she saw Mike. She grabbed him from the ears and pushed him towards the main door. While grinding her teeth, she said, "See? We had to do all of this to Lily because of you!" Lily and her family moved away a few days later, and Mike couldn't see her friend ever again. He never received a letter nor a call from her, and he never even knew if she was still alive. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, and if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode!